Imagine standing on a frozen lake in the dead of winter, watching a line of oxen drag 2-ton cannons across ice that is cracking beneath your feet with every single step. One wrong move and the ice swallows the gun, the sledge, the oxen, and maybe even the man walking beside them. Now, imagine the person leading this insane operation isn't a general. He isn't a career soldier. He's a 25-year-old former bookseller who had never commanded troops in his life. This is not fiction. This actually happened in the winter of 1775. And what this young man pulled off would end up saving the American Revolution before it even had a real chance to begin.
Before any of this, Henry Knox was just a big, cheerful guy running a bookstore in Boston. He was over 6 feet tall, built like someone who should be lifting crates instead of flipping pages, and he had a laugh that filled the whole shop. But behind that friendly exterior was a mind that never stopped absorbing information. He had dropped out of school at 12 years old to support his family after his father walked out on him, so almost everything he knew, he taught himself. And what he chose to study obsessively, for reasons nobody could have predicted at the time, was artillery. He read French military manuals until the pages fell apart. He studied the mathematics behind cannon trajectories and the chemistry of gunpowder like his life depended on it. Nobody around him had any idea that this quiet, self-taught knowledge would one day rewrite the outcome of a war. Everything changed in April 1775 when shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, and the American Revolution stopped being a political argument and became an actual war. Knox shut down his bookstore, grabbed his wife Lucy, and slipped past British checkpoints to join the fight. What's wild is that Lucy came from a wealthy loyalist family who despised the idea of her marrying a tradesman with rebel sympathies. And when she chose Henry anyway, her own parents disowned her. She lost everything to stand beside him. And once Knox reached the militia camps outside Boston, his years of self-taught expertise suddenly became the most valuable skill in the entire army, because nobody else around him understood artillery and fortifications the way he did. By the time George Washington took command of the Continental Army that summer, he was facing a problem that seemed impossible to solve. His troops had surrounded Boston on land, but the British controlled the harbor completely, and their navy could resupply the city whenever they wanted. Washington's men were farmers and tradesmen, not professional soldiers, and many of their enlistments were about to expire. Some units had less than 9 rounds of ammunition per man. Without heavy cannons to threaten the British ships and force them out, the entire siege was going to collapse under its own weight, and the Revolution could quietly die in the mud outside Boston before it ever really started. That's when Henry Knox stepped forward with an idea that sounded almost delusional. He knew that Fort Ticonderoga, captured months earlier by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, was sitting 300 miles away in upstate New York, packed with dozens of cannons that nobody had figured out how to use. Knox proposed traveling there himself, selecting the best artillery pieces and hauling them overland through the brutal winter wilderness, all the way back to Cambridge. Washington, desperate and out of better options, said yes. On November 17th, 1775, he made Knox a colonel and sent this 25-year-old bookseller north with almost no experience commanding anyone, just raw confidence and a stubborn belief that this could actually be done. When Knox arrived at Ticonderoga in early December, he found exactly what he had hoped for: an arsenal packed with heavy artillery just sitting unused. He personally inspected each weapon, checking for rot and damage, and eventually selected 59 cannons, mortars, and howitzers, weighing roughly 60 tons combined. Some individual guns weighed as much as a modern car. He arranged 42 sledges, 80 yoke of oxen, and a custom-built barge to move everything down Lake George. On paper, it sounded organized. In reality, it meant hauling 60 tons of iron through frozen wilderness with almost no margin for error. And Knox knew that if he waited for perfect weather, the mission would be too late to matter at all. The journey down Lake George alone was terrifying. Ice that looked solid one moment would groan and crack the next. And at one point, a cannon actually broke through and sank, forcing Knox's exhausted men to fish it back out of freezing water, using nothing but ropes and sheer strength. Every crossing was a gamble between moving fast enough to matter and moving carefully enough to survive. When they reached the Hudson River near Albany, the same nightmare repeated itself, with men walking ahead on the ice, listening for the sound of it giving way beneath a 2-ton sledge. Knox recorded these disasters in his journal with an almost exhausted calm, never once suggesting that turning back was an option worth considering.
Then came the Berkshire Mountains, and this is where the mission nearly broke entirely. The roads barely deserved the name. Narrow, frozen tracks winding through dense forest and exposed ridges where the wind hit hard enough to knock a man off balance. In some places, Knox's men had to chop down trees just to widen the path enough for the sledges to pass through. Going uphill was slow and brutal, but going downhill was genuinely dangerous, because a loaded cannon sledge on a steep slope becomes an unstoppable battering ram that oxen and rope alone cannot control. Knox's crews wrapped chains around tree trunks to lower each sledge inch by inch, and even then, cannons broke loose, chains snapped, and one gun reportedly tumbled off the trail entirely into a ravine.
At any point during this brutal crossing, Knox could have left the heaviest cannons behind and pressed on with whatever was manageable. And honestly, nobody would have blamed him for it. He had already accomplished more than anyone thought possible. But Knox understood something that separated him from an ordinary commander facing an extraordinary task, which is that almost enough firepower would not be enough to change anything. He had promised Washington 60 tons of artillery, and he was determined to deliver every single pound of it, even if it meant risking his men, his animals, and himself on a mountainside in the middle of January. What kept this entire operation alive wasn't just Knox's stubbornness. It was the small towns along the way who had no obligation to help, but did anyway. Farmers lent their oxen when Knox's teams collapsed from exhaustion. Blacksmiths repaired broken sledges for free. Families opened their barns for storage and their homes for warmth to strangers hauling cannons through their village. These weren't grand historical gestures. They were quiet acts of trust from ordinary people who understood, even without being told directly, that this strange convoy passing through their town actually mattered for something much bigger than themselves. By late January 1776, roughly 2 months after leaving Cambridge, Knox's caravan finally rolled into camp, covered in ice and road grime, but almost completely intact. 59 artillery pieces, 60 tons of equipment, dragged 300 miles through the worst conditions the Northeast could throw at them, and not a single man had died in the process. Washington wasted no time putting this new firepower to use. On the night of March 4th, more than 2,000 soldiers hauled Knox's cannons up Dorchester Heights under total darkness, building fortifications on frozen ground using prefabricated wooden frames because the earth was too hard to dig. When the British woke up the next morning, they looked up and saw a fully armed position looming over their entire garrison and the harbor where their ships sat completely exposed. General William Howe reportedly said the rebels had accomplished more in one night than his own army could manage in a month. With no realistic way to counter it, the British chose to evacuate Boston entirely on March 17th, loading over 9,000 troops onto ships and sailing away without a single major battle being fought. Washington later credited the artillery on Dorchester Heights as the deciding factor, and for the first time, delegates debating independence back in Philadelphia finally had real proof that this war could actually be won. Henry Knox didn't stop there either. He went on to command artillery at Trenton during Washington's famous crossing of the Delaware, fought through Brandywine, Monmouth, and eventually Yorktown, where his guns helped force Cornwallis into surrender and effectively ended the war. He later became the nation's first Secretary of War and helped establish West Point, shaping the military for generations that followed him. All of it traces back to a bookseller from Cornhill Street who taught himself everything he knew from the very books he sold, and who refused to accept that 60 tons of iron and 300 miles of frozen wilderness were reasons to quit. The road he carved through those mountains still exists today, mostly forgotten, but it's proof that the right person with enough stubborn belief can genuinely change the direction of history.